When I was a kid and into my early teens, I lived in a very unusual situation, deep in the woods. I'm still unsure whether what I encountered that night with my friend was some sort of spirit or something else. Maybe someone reading this can help explain what we experienced. I'm a girl and I was about 12 at the time. One of my closest friends, let's call him Jake, was 10. Jake's dad had purchased a big area of forest, around 60 miles from the city where we lived in Canada. Most of it was untouched wilderness. When his family bought the land, they cleared just a small area for their house, but the rest remained dense forest. A dirt road split their land into two sections. If you followed the road for a few miles, you'd eventually reach some other homes, but on either side of the road, the forest was very different. On the right side, where their house was, the forest felt open and bright. The trees weren't too thick and there were gentle hills. It was a pleasant place to spend time. But the left side was a different story. On the left, there was a deep ditch about 6 feet down and then a steep hill covered in moss. Over the top of the hill, the forest had a very unsettling feeling. The trees were tall and dark, mostly pines, and the air felt heavier. It always gave off a bad vibe, like the forest itself was telling you to stay away. Jake and I didn't like going over there and playfully started calling it the Demon's Woods. One fall afternoon, probably in 2001 or 2002, my family went to visit Jake's family. While the adults hung out, Jake and I went off to play in the forest. Jake's dad warned us before we left that some kind of animal had been getting into their trash lately. He thought it looked like a dog, maybe a stray Rottweiler, and warned us not to go near it if we saw it because it didn't look healthy. It was a calm, overcast day with no wind. The leaves had turned golden and red, and many had already fallen. We decided to walk along the dirt road with the bright forest on one side and the Demon's Woods on the other. As we walked, we started feeling uneasy as we passed the steep hill on the left side. But we tried to be brave, telling ourselves it was just our imaginations. As we continued, I noticed something strange. A large, dark pine tree hung over the road, and someone had tied a pink ribbon to one of its branches. The ribbon was flapping wildly in the wind, except there was no wind at all. The day was completely still. I even reached out to touch the ribbon, and it continued flapping, though I felt no breeze. I pointed it out to Jake, but he didn't seem bothered and kept walking, so I let it go. We eventually reached a spot where the hill sloped down in a way that made it easier to climb. It created a sort of natural amphitheater with the road we stood on acting like the stage. We could see clearly up the hill into the Demon's Woods, which were covered in fallen leaves. The trees started at the top about 30 feet higher. Jake suddenly got excited. He said he had heard a wild cat up in the woods and told me that once he and his dad had seen one with kittens. I didn't hear anything, but he was convinced, so he started meowing, hoping the cat would respond. I thought it was a silly idea, but before I could say anything, the forest meowed back. Jake was thrilled. He kept meowing, and each time, something in the woods meowed back. This continued for a while, and though it sounded like a cat, something about it felt off. Wild animals usually don't behave like this, and it wasn't an echo either. There were no hard surfaces for sound to bounce off of, and the meows were responding to us instantly. As Jake kept calling, the sound of rustling leaves came from the woods, as if something was coming toward us. But it didn't sound like a small animal. The footsteps were too heavy. It sounded like something much larger, and there were more than one. Multiple footsteps, approaching from different directions. The weirdest part was that we could see the hill clearly, but there was nothing there, no animals, no movement. Yet the rustling sounds kept getting closer. Jake was still convinced the kittens were coming, but I felt my heart racing with fear. I was on the edge of telling him we needed to leave when I heard loud panting right at my feet. At first, I wasn't too alarmed. We had a dog at home and I was used to the sound. But then I realized, of course, my dog wasn't with me. This had to be another dog, but I couldn't see anything. There was nothing at my feet or anywhere nearby, yet the sound was clear. I spun around, trying to find the source, but there was nothing. Finally, I spotted a dog about 300 feet away at the top of the slope. It looked like the Rottweiler Jake's dad had warned us about. Patchy fur, dirty, and sickly looking, but the panting sound was still right at my feet, and this dog was too far away for me to be hearing it from there. That was the last straw. I grabbed Jake, and we ran as fast as we could back to his house. We didn't stop until we were inside, panting as hard as the unseen dog. After that, we stayed away from the demon's woods. During the summer, I found myself deep in the White Mountains, hiking alone, about 8 miles away from the nearest recreation area. I prefer to go off the marked trails, exploring hidden spots like ponds and such. That day, I came across a campsite that looked like it had seen something straight out of a horror movie. Someone who had been camping or hiking there had gotten into serious trouble. It was around 7 a.m. when I stumbled upon the scene. The campsite was completely destroyed, as if a tornado had passed through. There was trash scattered everywhere, clothes torn to shreds, and the tent ripped apart as if chewed through. The air reeked of decay and human waste. The eerie silence around me was unsettling until I noticed a person under a tree, near the tent, covered in blood and quietly whimpering. They were full of open wounds, some deep enough to expose muscle, though they weren't bleeding heavily anymore. Whatever happened had occurred some time ago. The person had clearly been lying there for a while, and the smell around the area was starting to make sense. I dropped my pack, grabbed my first aid kit, and went over to help. They looked like they had just lost a brutal fight, with slashes from shoulder to hip and punctures all over their back, along with defensive cuts on their hands and arms. I did what I could to patch them up, gave them some water, and checked my map. The closest road was about 2 miles away, but hiking through the dense brush wasn't exactly quick. I rushed toward the road, all the while trying to figure out what had happened. Was the person camping alone, or did a disagreement with someone turn violent? Or maybe a stranger had attacked them. There was always the chance it had been an animal, but if so, why didn't the animal finish the job? I finally made it to the road, but wasn't sure which direction to head. There wasn't any sign of a town nearby, so I just started walking north. Luckily, I managed to flag down a couple of guys driving a beat-up Jeep. I explained what I had found, and by the time I finished, their faces had gone pale. They promised to get help and said they would lead the authorities back to where I found them. We made a plan to meet back at this exact spot since it was the quickest way to guide them to the scene. The rescue was like a relay, with each person knowing only part of the way to get there. The guys in the Jeep knew how to reach town and would bring the authorities back to me, and then I'd take them to the injured person. It took about an hour for the rescue team to arrive. When I led them back, the person was barely responsive. I honestly thought they wouldn't make it. Sitting there for so long, it seemed inevitable that something terrible would happen. It took another hour to get the emergency crew into the canyon. I helped carry the person out, and once we got them on the stretcher, I realized the wounds were worse than I had first thought. Every part of their body was crushed or sliced, with fat and muscle hanging out. During the steep climb out, the person drifted in and out of consciousness, which was no surprise considering the pain they must have been in for so long. We finally got them to the emergency vehicle. The sheriff and forest rangers offered me a ride back to town, and I accepted. After getting cleaned up at the station and giving them my contact information, I headed home. A few days later, I got a call from the sheriff's office. The story they told me was shocking. The person I had found had decided to go camping and had heard that they should hang their food from a tree to keep bears away. They had done that, but had hung it too close to the tent and not high enough. The night before I found the campsite, a bear had tried to climb the tree to get the food, using the tent and the person inside as a stepping stone. The camper had woken up to a bear's paws pressing down on their body as it tried to reach for the food. Miraculously, they survived, but they swore to the hospital staff that they were moving to the city and would never set foot in the woods again. I want to start by saying I'm sorry. Please don't think this is one of those tales where I make you carry the monster from my mind into yours. I just need to share this. I'm from Lebanon, and we have our own version of the werewolf called the Narfel. I always thought it was just a myth. The legend says that a high-ranking official in the resistance, along with a member of the paranormal defense unit, made a pact with intelligent beings that weren't human, creatures with fur that could speak an ancient dialect called Tashin. To me, this sounded like some fabricated origin story, a piece of propaganda to boost the morale of the Lebanese. You know, something like, we can do anything, but there are those who swear it's real. I didn't buy into any of it, not until I went to Europe and had my own encounter. My cousin and I traveled to northern Italy to film a promotional video. We were staying at a cabin near the edge of a forest, maybe 300 kilometers of woods with caves scattered throughout. One night, we went to film a scene deep in the woods. My cousin thought it'd be best to shoot at night. We did this for several days, and for 3 weeks, everything was fine. But on the 4th week, just as we were packing up our gear after a long shoot, we started hearing strange scratching sounds and growls. My cousin looked almost pleased, like he was hearing from an old friend. I thought it was odd, but I didn't say anything. This continued for 6 nights straight, always between 8 p.m. and 6 a.m. On the 8th day, after the first encounter, we found scratch marks on the side of the cabin. My cousin nearly cried, but it was more like tears of joy. By the 14th day, we found fur stuck to a thorny bush near the cabin. My cousin mumbled something under his breath, Kavari, or something like that, which meant nothing to me at the time. On the 17th day, I saw something behind the cabin. It looked like a wolf, but it didn't make sense. This was Italy. Wolves don't usually wander around these parts. Then, to my shock, the thing stood up on 2 legs. It was walking upright. My cousin came into my room and, in his broken English, told me, "No worry, you must sleep now." I tried to explain what I saw, but he just sat me down and told me the same old story about how Lebanon made a deal with the Narfel. For the first time, I found myself wondering if there was some truth to it. Then came day 28, the worst day. My cousin called me outside to stargaze since we didn't get to do that often back home. As I stepped outside, I heard the creature before I saw it. It spoke a familiar phrase in Tashin, something like, "It's been too long, my friend." My cousin stood up and, without hesitation, repeated the word Kavari and began walking toward this beast. That's when I realized my cousin wasn't just reckless. He was completely out of his mind. Felt like hours, but in reality, it was only a few seconds. My cousin spoke in Tashin again, something like, "Greetings, comrade." To my utter disbelief, the wolf creature responded. They were speaking. I couldn't understand what was being said. I was too terrified to think straight. Just as I was about to run, my cousin stopped me, urging me not to move. Then he bent down and I noticed 2 smaller figures next to the larger one. Whatever he said to them, I didn't hear. All I caught was his final phrase, "Farewell until next time." In that moment, I finally understood. His story wasn't just madness. There was truth to it. Lebanon really did have some sort of connection to these beings. My cousin wasn't a liar or a fool. To these creatures, he was family, a protector, even though most stories about the Narfel involve terror, death, or worse. I can't shake the feeling that I'm somehow responsible for everything that happened. Now, you understand why I apologized. We Lebanese have always believed these creatures to be intelligent, capable of emotions, and that maybe, just maybe, our ancestors had something to do with their existence. While I think my cousin was doing what he thought was right for them, I'm not so sure it was best for the rest of humanity. I've spent countless hours hiking through deep forests and have come across some strange and creepy things, but usually they have a logical explanation. I've also heard even stranger stories, stuff I figured people just made up for attention. I don't entertain a lot of what I consider nonsense, but this is the only moment in my life that I cannot explain. I enjoy distance hiking when I can, which sometimes means getting up early or staying out late to cover as many miles as possible. It's a demanding hobby that not everyone understands, but those who do know the rewards. You get to see places and landscapes most people never will, breathe air untouched by pollution, and swim in waters that aren't spoiled. Plus, it's one of the best full-body exercises out there, and I find it therapeutic. But anyway, sometimes when you're hiking in the dark with just a headlamp, it gets creepy. You keep your hands free just in case something dangerous, like a bear or cougar, jumps out at you. I don't believe in the supernatural, but real predators like those are out there. And when you're deep in the woods, every little noise in the bushes can feel like life or death. That's the only part of hiking that ever really gets to me, but it's just part of the experience. I grew up in the woods around here, slept under the stars more times than I can count, and hiked thousands of miles on trails, by rivers, lakes, ridges, swamps, and streams. I've hunted animals too. I'm telling you all this because it's important you know that I'm familiar with these woods. They're like home to me. The scariest thing I've ever experienced happened around 4:30 in the morning, during late spring, in the same forest I'd hiked for years. The first bit of dawn wouldn't break through the trees for another 30 to 45 minutes, with sunrise still about an hour away. I was on my 5th mile, barely getting tired, pacing myself to save energy for later. The entire forest was covered in that damp, misty spring chill that's common here. I was in a low area between 2 steep ridges, on a narrow, muddy trail surrounded by thick brush, young maples, and old oak trees. I had my headlamp on, focused only on putting one foot in front of the other, not paying much attention to anything else. There was nothing to look at in the dark anyway. The goal was just to get through without twisting my ankle or getting bitten by something. Then I heard a loud crack. I stopped dead in my tracks. It was such a strange sound to hear, especially 5 or 6 miles deep into the wilderness, in the stillness of dawn. It wasn't a sound I'd ever heard before. Let me explain. At 4:30 in the spring, the woods are completely silent. No birds are singing yet, and the nocturnal animals are winding down. There's this weird overlap where nothing is stirring, and the quiet is almost overwhelming. It's a time when hunters like to get into position because the woods are so still. When that loud crack echoed through the silence, my fight or flight instinct kicked in. My first thought was, if I hear that again, I'm turning around and heading back as fast as I can. Because whatever made that sound wasn't just a branch breaking. It wasn't a tree falling. It was something deliberate. Hearing it once was unnerving, but if I heard it again, I knew it was something territorial, like a rattlesnake shaking its tail to warn you off. The worst part was that I knew where the sound came from, and I knew where the trail led. In about 30 yards, it would make a sharp turn and head up a ridge. That meant as soon as I started walking toward the noise, I'd have to turn my back on it to climb the hill. And that made me really nervous. My mind was racing, imagining everything from a wild animal to some maniac lurking in the woods. Minutes passed as I stood there, just breathing and listening. Nothing. Dead silence. I had about 20 minutes before the first light would start to show. So, I cranked up my headlamp and slowly started toward the turn, trying to move quietly. But when you wear a headlamp in the woods, every branch casts a big, dark shadow that dances on the trail, which doesn't help your nerves. I finally made it to the turn, quickly rounded the corner, and started up the ridge as fast as I could without making too much noise. My heart was pounding. Then I smelled it, I stopped in my tracks. There was this horrible stench in the air, something I can only describe as wet, rotting death. I've worked in emergency services and been around human bodies after they've decayed for days, and this was similar but different. Being so far from civilization, it was hard to imagine what could have made that smell. It wasn't garbage, sewage, or a campfire. It was just wrong. I kept walking faster now. By the time I reached the top of the ridge, the first light was starting to show, and I didn't stop moving until the sun was fully up and the birds were finally singing again. Once the daylight came, I felt safer. Whatever had made that noise and that smell had chosen to leave me alone. I've heard and seen it all in the woods, but I have no idea what I encountered that morning. To this day, I've never heard anything like it again. I've spent countless hours hiking through deep forests and have come across some strange and creepy things, but usually they have a logical explanation. I've also heard even stranger stories, stuff I figured people just made up for attention. I don't entertain a lot of what I consider nonsense, but this is the only moment in my life that I cannot explain. I enjoy distance hiking when I can, which sometimes means getting up early or staying out late to cover as many miles as possible. It's a demanding hobby that not everyone understands, but those who do know the rewards. You get to see places and landscapes most people never will, breathe air untouched by pollution, and swim in waters that aren't spoiled. Plus, it's one of the best full-body exercises out there, and I find it therapeutic. But anyway, sometimes when you're hiking in the dark with just a headlamp, it gets creepy. You keep your hands free just in case something dangerous, like a bear or cougar, jumps out at you. I don't believe in the supernatural, but real predators like those are out there. And when you're deep in the woods, every little noise in the bushes can feel like life or death. That's the only part of hiking that ever really gets to me, but it's just part of the experience. I grew up in the woods around here, slept under the stars more times than I can count, and hiked thousands of miles on trails, by rivers, lakes, ridges, swamps, and streams. I've hunted animals too. I'm telling you all this because it's important you know that I'm familiar with these woods. They're like home to me. The scariest thing I've ever experienced happened around 4:30 in the morning, during late spring, in the same forest I'd hiked for years. The first bit of dawn wouldn't break through the trees for another 30 to 45 minutes, with sunrise still about an hour away. I was on my 5th mile, barely getting tired, pacing myself to save energy for later. The entire forest was covered in that damp, misty spring chill that's common here. I was in a low area between 2 steep ridges, on a narrow, muddy trail surrounded by thick brush, young maples, and old oak trees. I had my headlamp on, focused only on putting one foot in front of the other, not paying much attention to anything else. There was nothing to look at in the dark anyway. The goal was just to get through without twisting my ankle or getting bitten by something. Then I heard a loud crack. I stopped dead in my tracks. It was such a strange sound to hear, especially 5 or 6 miles deep into the wilderness, in the stillness of dawn. It wasn't a sound I'd ever heard before. Let me explain. At 4:30 in the spring, the woods are completely silent. No birds are singing yet, and the nocturnal animals are winding down. There's this weird overlap where nothing is stirring, and the quiet is almost overwhelming. It's a time when hunters like to get into position because the woods are so still. When that loud crack echoed through the silence, my fight or flight instinct kicked in. My first thought was, if I hear that again, I'm turning around and heading back as fast as I can. Because whatever made that sound wasn't just a branch breaking. It wasn't a tree falling. It was something deliberate. Hearing it once was unnerving, but if I heard it again, I knew it was something territorial, like a rattlesnake shaking its tail to warn you off. The worst part was that I knew where the sound came from, and I knew where the trail led. In about 30 yards, it would make a sharp turn and head up a ridge. That meant as soon as I started walking toward the noise, I'd have to turn my back on it to climb the hill. And that made me really nervous. My mind was racing, imagining everything from a wild animal to some maniac lurking in the woods. Minutes passed as I stood there, just breathing and listening. Nothing. Dead silence. I had about 20 minutes before the first light would start to show. So, I cranked up my headlamp and slowly started toward the turn, trying to move quietly. But when you wear a headlamp in the woods, every branch casts a big, dark shadow that dances on the trail, which doesn't help your nerves. I finally made it to the turn, quickly rounded the corner, and started up the ridge as fast as I could without making too much noise. My heart was pounding. Then I smelled it. I stopped in my tracks. There was this horrible stench in the air, something I can only describe as wet, rotting death. I've worked in emergency services and been around human bodies after they've decayed for days, and this was similar, but different. Being so far from civilization, it was hard to imagine what could have made that smell. It wasn't garbage, sewage, or a campfire. It was just wrong. I kept walking faster now. By the time I reached the top of the ridge, the first light was starting to show, and I didn't stop moving until the sun was fully up and the birds were finally singing again. Once the daylight came, I felt safer. Whatever had made that noise and that smell had chosen to leave me alone. I've heard and seen it all in the woods, but I have no idea what I encountered that morning. To this day, I've never heard anything like it again. My friends and I planned a camping trip over spring break, something we had arranged about a week ahead of time. As the trip neared, the weather turned bad. It was cold and overcast, which was unusual for Alabama. By the time the night came, yet another cold front had moved in. Though I was in my 40s, we bundled up and made sure to bring plenty of whiskey and beer. The plan was to head to a remote spot my friend knew, a place only reachable by his 4x4 truck. We didn't want to camp at one of those designated family or RV sites, so we headed far out into the wilderness, away from the tiny town with just a stoplight and a few hundred people. After about half an hour of jostling over dry creek beds and dodging trees, it began to rain. By the time we found the campsite, the rain had turned into hail. The spot was marked by an old dirt road and the rusted remains of a VW Beetle. That night, we passed around a bottle, hoping to set up our tents before we got too drunk. Eventually, we managed to pitch them and started a fire using some diesel fuel. The hail finally stopped, and the empty whiskey bottle was tossed into the fire, where it shattered. Our collection of empties kept growing as we drank, played cards, and eventually passed out in our tents. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of something large being dragged past my tent. I peeked out to see what looked like a rusted-out station wagon, dragging the VW Beetle behind it with a chain. The Beetle had been there for so long that its floor had rotted, and tree roots had started to grow through it. A woman was driving the station wagon, with a man sitting beside her and 3 shirtless kids in the back, where seats used to be. The man stared blankly out the window the entire time, never looking our way. The kids' faces were smudged with dirt, and their empty stares were unsettling, like something you might see in photos of extreme poverty. It was the kind of poverty you only hear about in the most desperate places. The gas station back in town, where you might imagine hearing the tune from Deliverance, was probably the closest thing to a city for these people. The woman spoke in a deep, raspy voice, the kind that comes from years of smoking and drinking. "Y'all come from the city to do some camping? Well, that's fine, long as you ain't doing no drugs. Y'all ain't on drugs, right?" We assured her we weren't. "Good. I drink too from time to time. Ain't nothing wrong with that," she said. Then she told us something odd. "I know y'all were here, 'cause I seen them black helicopters flying around. Got some folks that work for me, they told me." She claimed the land was hers and laughed. her laugh turning into a wheeze. The man beside her kept staring out the window, and one of the kids pressed his hands and face against the glass, staring blankly at us. His mouth hung open, and drool smeared the filthy window. He looked about 10 years old. The woman asked if we knew someone named Sarah. We didn't. "Everyone knows Sarah," she said. Then she asked if we went to church. I lied and said we did. "Good," she replied. "Ain't got time for people who don't fear God. Y'all should come to church tomorrow. It's just over that hill. Can't miss it. Sarah would love to meet y'all." They all would. We promised we'd come, and she slowly drove away, dragging the old VW Beetle behind her into the woods. As soon as she was gone, we all looked at each other and burst out laughing, but it wasn't funny. It was just nerves. We had that primal sense that something wasn't right. It was a feeling that hit before she even spoke. The moment I looked into her eyes, something was off. The woman, the kids, the man who never spoke, her laugh. Everything about it felt wrong. Later, we hiked up the hill she had pointed to, and from the top we could see for miles. There was nothing, no church, no buildings, just endless forest. We ended up cutting the trip short and packing up to leave before noon. The following story was shared on an online forum on April 22, 2013, under the title The Fallen Tree by an anonymous poster. I've only told this to a few people, and even now, thinking about it still sends chills down my spine. I was about 17 at the time, growing up in a small rural town. Exploring the surrounding hills was a common activity. This event took place at the northern edge of Crystal Valley, in Elko County, Nevada, near an old road off Highway 93 that leads into the valley. I've always been fascinated by abandoned mines and ghost towns, so I was eager to check out some places I'd seen marked on old maps at the local diner in my hometown of Wells. I fueled up my old 1972 Dodge pickup and, being an enthusiast of guns, brought along my 91 Hong Kong dollars rifle. After finding some ruins in the lower hills, I ventured further into the mountains, discovering abandoned mine shafts along the way. I followed an old road, now little more than an overgrown trail, until I came across a large fallen tree, a pinyon pine that blocked my path. After driving a bit further, I parked the truck and decided to proceed on foot. I always carried a rifle for protection, as I'd encountered mountain lions near mine shafts before. I climbed over the tree and immediately felt something was wrong, like I was being watched. It was an eerie feeling that grew stronger as I walked along. The silence was unsettling. No birds, no insects, just complete stillness. It was early summer, so normally, the air would be buzzing with the sound of cicadas, but after crossing that tree, there was nothing. As I continued, I spotted a massive rock about 15 feet across that looked like it had once blocked the road before sliding off due to erosion. It appeared to be a reddish limestone, not common in that area. There were markings on the rock, but years of weather had worn them down. Despite my growing unease, I pressed on toward an old cabin I had heard about. When I reached it, I noticed that unlike other abandoned cabins I'd explored, this one was in relatively good shape. The windows were intact, and there were tattered curtains behind the glass. The place felt wrong, but I went inside. The cabin was fully furnished. An old mattress, cookware, tattered clothes, and even faded pictures remained. But what really unnerved me was the dining table, set as if 4 people were ready to sit down for a meal. It was as though the occupants had left in a hurry, abandoning everything. I stepped back outside, feeling the weight of the silence again. I decided to load my rifle, and the sound of the chambering echoed through the canyon, offering a brief moment of comfort. Behind me, I noticed an old well. As I approached it, I was hit by an overpowering stench. Something had died down there. The smell of decay and something metallic filled the air. I turned away from the well and spotted the entrance to a mine shaft nearby. A hot breeze blew out of the shaft, which struck me as odd, since mine shafts usually maintain a cool temperature. The closer I got, the more I felt like I was being watched. The feeling of dread intensified. Just as I neared the entrance, the smell of rot hit me even harder. I knew I had to leave. As I turned to go, I saw a shadow moving inside the mine. It was large, hunched, and covered in fur. At first, I thought it might be a mountain lion, but it was much bigger. Panic set in. I raised my rifle and fired several rounds at it, hearing the distinct thuds of the bullets hitting their mark. The creature let out a scream unlike anything I'd ever heard. It was in pain, and then I heard more screams from the well and the hills above me. I ran as fast as I could toward my truck, hearing movement in the trees. Whatever these things were, they were fast and closing in. I emptied my magazine, loaded a fresh one, and kept running. By the time I reached the fallen tree, the creatures were just behind me, moving from tree to tree. I fired more rounds before reaching my truck. I got in, started the engine, and sped off, not slowing down until I hit the pavement. When I finally made it home, I was in shock. My dad, who had been a hunting guide in the Ruby Mountains for 2 decades, noticed my state and asked where I had been. I told him I had been exploring north of Crystal Valley. His face grew serious, and he told me never to go back there, especially alone. We never spoke of it again. I've never returned, partly because I now live in Western Nevada, but there's always been a part of me that wants to go back, as if something is calling me. One day I will return, but next time I'll bring a camera and friends, just in case. Years later, I asked some locals about the area. One old-timer shared a story about the 1940s when military planes would crash in the Ruby Mountains during bad weather. Ranchers were sometimes called in to help recover the bodies. One rancher told me they found the bodies of an entire crew laid out side by side, as if someone had moved them after the crash. The story only deepened the mystery of what I encountered that day. This story took place in July of 2003. I was 13, about to start middle school, when my father decided to take me and my older brother, let's call him Mark, on a fishing trip in Alaska. My dad worked in the Chicago steel industry and had a business associate in Anchorage. They had planned this trip to bond over fishing in the remote areas of southern Alaska. The associate was bringing his teenage daughter along, so Dad decided to take his 2 middle children, me and Mark. Mark and I were very close, always getting into harmless trouble together, so our parents often called us the Double Trouble Duo. Mom figured that being in the wilderness would keep us out of trouble for a change. Our destination was a 2-day drive from Chicago. We first drove to Seattle, where we spent the night, and then met up with Dad's business friend the following morning to continue north. The area we were heading to was pretty far out there. The scenery was beautiful, but this part of Alaska was so remote that not many people spoke English. Mark had done 2 years of high school Spanish, and I had just started learning French, but neither language helped much out there. Fortunately, Dad spoke the local dialect fluently, and the lady who served us lunch was patient with our clumsy attempts to communicate. A few hours after lunch, we veered off the main road and soon found ourselves on a path where we were practically the only ones around, aside from some local logging trucks. Mark and I, being kids from the suburbs, were fascinated by the massive trucks carrying giant tree trunks. We even joked about meeting some rugged lumberjacks. We were still laughing about it when we arrived at the outfitter's place. Dad purchased fishing permits, and we packed all our gear and food onto the company's boat. The ride down the river was breathtaking. Towering forests, mountains in the distance, a crystal clear lake, and the sound of nothing but the boat's engine. We passed by a few small cabins along the shore, each with its own dock and rowboats. A couple of them had smoke rising from chimneys. We continued deeper across the lake, heading south. Dad had mentioned we'd be staying in a cabin on a lake, but what he hadn't said was that it was on a tiny island in the middle of the lake. The only way to reach it was by boat. The island was small, with just enough room for the cabin, a pile of firewood, and a dock with 2 rowboats. The closest shore was a few hundred yards away. There would be no lumberjacks or even squirrels for us to meet. We pulled up to the dock, unloaded our supplies, and settled into the cabin. It was small but cozy, with bunk beds and a wood stove. After unpacking, we started preparing dinner, some canned stew. We tried making small talk with the associate's daughter, who was around 16. She seemed shy and awkward, but we tried to be friendly. Still, Mark and I shared silent looks behind her back, rolling our eyes in unison. We were doing this for Dad, after all. That night, with nothing to do, no TV or electronics, we went to bed early. The idea of an early bedtime would have annoyed us back in Chicago, but here it seemed fitting. Mark and I giggled for a while in our bunks until Dad told us to quiet down. Mark joked, "This is why boys don't do sleepovers," which made us both crack up again. We woke up before dawn, had breakfast, bacon, toast, and coffee. I can't stand eggs. And then headed out onto the lake in 2 rowboats. The mist rolled over the water in the soft morning light, making the lake look magical. It was my first time fishing, and I quickly realized I hated it. The dads were having a great time bonding, which was the whole point of the trip. The associate kept trying to talk to Mark, even though we'd both told him we had friends back home. After a while, I managed to catch 1 fish, a large pike, the biggest any of us would catch that trip. But I dreaded having to learn how to clean it. In total, we caught enough fish for a few meals and then returned to the cabin for lunch. That afternoon, I decided not to go back out on the lake. I told Dad I'd stay behind to tend to the fire and prepare dinner. I think he understood that I'd given fishing my best shot. Mark gave me a look, pleading for me to join him since he didn't want to be stuck alone with the associate's daughter. But I wasn't budging. While they were out on the water, I tidied up the cabin and went outside. It was so peaceful. That's when things started to get strange. I noticed that the usual sounds of the wilderness, birds, insects, were missing. The thick forest on the shore across the lake felt untouched by humans, as though no one had ever walked there before. But then, I saw something. A tall, human-like figure in the shadows, staring back at me. At first, I thought my mind was playing tricks, but then it moved slightly. It was large, with a head that resembled a deer's, but it stood on 2 legs, and it was staring at me with a sense of hostility. I was grateful for the lake between us, but the encounter made me uneasy. I hurried back into the cabin and locked the door. I grabbed a book and tried to distract myself. When Dad returned and knocked on the door, I pretended I had locked it because of the wind. He seemed to buy it. Later, I pulled Mark aside and told him what I had seen. At first, he teased me, saying I was just imagining things, but eventually he realized I was serious. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that the creature was still out there, watching us. The next morning, they all went fishing again. I stayed behind, still feeling uneasy. As I stared across the lake at the forest, I found myself wondering if I could swim over there. The thought became an obsession. What would happen if I went there, the first human to set foot on that shore? By the time everyone came back from fishing, I was glad we were leaving that afternoon. Less than 2 months later, I started middle school, and the world changed. Looking back, I've traveled and seen a lot since then, but I've never encountered a forest as wild or untouched as the one in Alaska. Sometimes, I wonder what might have happened if I had crossed the lake. It was pretty common for my dad to pick up me and my brothers after school and head up into the mountains for an afternoon of gathering firewood. Dad would chop down trees and saw them into manageable pieces, while my brothers and I rolled the logs over to the truck and loaded them. We followed this routine until the truck was full, usually before dark. Hot, sweaty, and worn out, we'd all pile into the truck and head back down the mountain. The next day, we would unload the wood, split it, and stack it into neat rows. This process continued until we had enough wood to last us through winter, with extra for our grandmother's cabin and elderly neighbors. One particular afternoon, we decided to try a different logging trail on the far side of the valley. This was well outside our usual area for gathering wood. My dad didn't really give a reason for the change, just said he wanted a different view. This road hadn't been maintained for a while, with big rocks and fallen branches scattered across it. My brothers and I had to walk ahead, pushing the debris aside while Dad carefully drove the truck up the winding path. As we climbed higher up the mountain, a strange feeling started to settle in. It was hard to tell if it was just the tough hike or something more, but there was a sense of unease, like the mountain itself was aware of us and not too happy about it. I was about to say something when my younger brother suddenly asked, "Does anyone else feel like we shouldn't be here?" My older brother and I froze and looked at each other. We both nodded in agreement. Before we could say more, Dad honked the horn and motioned for us to keep clearing the path. We reluctantly continued until we reached a small clearing in the woods and stopped the truck. My dad, either unaware of our discomfort or ignoring it, grabbed his saw and got to work. As we gathered the wood, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. My brothers kept glancing over their shoulders too, but Dad remained focused on the job as the sun started to dip behind the trees and twilight set in. That uneasy feeling only grew stronger. Then, surprisingly, Dad told us to pack up. It was unusual since the truck wasn't fully loaded, and Dad usually insisted on filling it, even if it meant working after dark. But tonight, he seemed eager to leave. With the wood packed up, we started down the mountain. Even though we were exhausted, the mood lightened as we cracked jokes and tried to shake off the weirdness from earlier. We were nearly out of the forest and into the open desert below when suddenly, a brown blur jumped out from the slope. "Deer!" my dad yelled, slamming on the brakes. With the truck loaded and heading downhill, there was no avoiding the collision. We came to a halt, and all four of us stared out the windshield in silence. Under the truck's headlights, we could see the crumpled body of a deer. Cursing under his breath, Dad got out to check the damage. He told my brothers to stay in the truck, but I didn't listen and followed him. The truck was fine, just some blood and fur on the front. But as we approached the deer, a horrible stench hit us. Much worse than a normal deer. It smelled like decay. The closer we got, the more we realized something was very wrong. The deer's eyes were gone, leaving dark, hollow sockets. Its tongue was swollen and black, hanging out of its mouth. Its belly was split open, with guts spilling onto the ground. Even in the dim light, it looked like the fur and entrails were moving. Holding my breath, I bent down for a better look. My heart skipped a beat. The deer was covered in maggots. Hadn't just died. This thing had been dead for days, maybe even longer. I backed away, my stomach turning. That weird electric feeling was back, stronger than ever. I glanced at my dad. His usual calm expression was gone, replaced with sheer horror. He wasn't looking at the deer anymore. His gaze was fixed on the forest beyond. "Get back in the truck," he said quietly, his voice tight with fear. I didn't argue. I ran back, jumped in, and slammed the door. Just then, a loud shriek echoed from the trees. Branches snapped as something big came crashing through the forest. Heading straight for us. My dad was back in the truck in a flash. Before his door was even fully shut, he hit the gas, and we sped down the mountain, barreling over the deer carcass. My brothers and I were yelling, but it was hard to tell if the shrieking was following us or if it was just our imaginations. Once we cleared the forest and hit the open desert, the noise stopped. We finally pulled into our driveway and sat in the truck, too shaken to move. After a long silence, we all started talking at once, asking the same questions. What was that? How did a dead deer jump in front of us? Dad silenced us and explained what had happened. He said he'd felt uneasy all day but didn't want to scare us. As twilight set in, he noticed figures moving between the trees, but they were always just out of focus. When we hit the deer and saw how long it had been dead, he realized something had thrown it in front of us to stop the truck. Whatever was in the woods that day didn't want us there. It wasn't just a warning. It wanted us gone, maybe even worse. We never returned to that mountain, and the road was later closed by the Forest Service. None of us have any desire to hike back up there again. This is what happened to some friends and me in a small town in New Zealand when we wanted to sneak out for some underage drinking. We'd buy a few bottles of beer or spirits and hike about 3 kilometers into the forest, far from civilization, to drink without fear of getting caught. In the summer, we'd crash in our sleeping bags under the open sky and be just fine. This was the kind of adventure that defined our teenage years. Roaming the dirt trails with a drink in hand, surrounded by our closest buddies. We weren't looking for trouble, damage, or to bother anyone. It was just part of growing up, finding ourselves. I'm sure every place has something like this for young people. However, what happened to us on this particular night was far from normal. One afternoon, my friends decided it was the perfect night to go camping, and we headed to our usual hangout spot with beer in hand. It was a spur-of-the-moment thing, no planning, just packing and jumping into the truck for the ride. In hindsight, this was a mistake because none of us checked the weather. We'd been caught in storms before, so we should have known better. Of course, there was a storm forecasted for that area later in the evening, but we didn't see a cloud in the sky as we drove, so we weren't worried. It seemed like the perfect night. We set up a small camp and started our party as the evening rolled on. Some were dancing, others chatting, but we were all drunk. It was exactly what we came to do. We were so good at it that we didn't notice the distant rumbling of thunder above us. By the time we did one last round of shots and passed out, the storm was creeping in. We were doing some pretty basic camping, just a fire pit, a few sleeping bags, maybe some chairs and a portable speaker. There was no real shelter, no trees, tarps, or tents. We had nothing to protect us, just the open forest. This was our escape, a place to be free. In the dead of night, all 5 of us, still tipsy, were woken up by the heavy rain pouring into our sleeping bags. Panic set in, and soon enough, lightning and thunder had us all completely freaked out. It's terrifying to be caught in a storm you didn't expect, with no shelter in sight. It felt like we were drowning, helpless, out of control, gasping for air, and desperately trying to escape. There were caves nearby, high up on a ridge overlooking a large river bend. We had a rough idea of where they were, but the storm had completely thrown us off. The flashes of lightning gave us quick glimpses of the landscape, but each time, we realized we'd gone the wrong way. It felt like a deadly game of hide and seek. We made it, though. The ground turned to thick mud, pulling our shoes off as we ran, and the rocks became slippery. But we scrambled up the ridge and into the mouth of the cave. We collapsed in a heap, catching our breath, flinching with every lightning flash or crash of thunder. Soaking wet and cold, we finally started laughing, harder than we ever had. It was terrifying just moments before, but now it seemed ridiculous. Still half drunk, a couple of us decided to dig a fire pit. We had a few lighters, and there was some dried brush scattered on the cave floor. We started scraping at the dirt with rocks and fingers, careful not to break a nail on hidden stones in the soil. We got about 4 inches deep when we found something unexpected: bones. They weren't just old bones. These were fresh enough to be recognizable, parts of a human body, with hair and skin still attached. Now, we were really in trouble. We couldn't leave the cave because of the storm raging outside, and we were trapped with a dead body in a shallow grave. Half of us were freaking out, crying in silence, stunned by what we had just uncovered. Was someone using this cave as a dumping ground? Was there a predator lurking deeper inside? We huddled together, too scared to speak, hoping for daylight to bring some clarity. We waited by the cave's entrance, trying to stay away from the body. The storm passed long before the sun came up, and as soon as we had enough light, we bolted. We ran right past our camp and deep into the woods, not stopping until we reached our neighborhood, bruised and bloodied. We told our parents what happened, and they quickly called the police. An investigation confirmed that the remains were part of an indigenous burial site, still used by remote communities. We didn't realize just how far out we'd gone into the wilderness. After that night, none of us ever went back there again, especially after spending a night with the dead.